In this lecture, we're going to discuss the second part of fungi. The first part, we talked about biology, and in this part, we're really going to focus on the medically relevant fungal diseases. So recall from our first lecture, we talked about how many different varieties there are of fungi. And in fact, there's 1.5 million species, if you can imagine, but only 300 of them actually cause human disease. Now, depending on the reason for which you're viewing this course, I'm presuming most of you are pre-professional health students going to medical school, dental school, or wherever. And in that case, really, most of the courses you'll take in microbiology will really focus on human disease. And in this case, for the fungi, those are the fungi we're going to focus on, the ones that actually cause human disease. And not just, we're obviously not going to talk about 300. We're really only going to talk about the very, very most important ones. So in the first lecture, we described the example disease, histoplasmosis, and we talked about how that particular fungi is dimorphic, that it has a yeast form in the human body and a spore form in soil. So we'll talk about another important example similar to histoplasmosis, but we'll also cover several other ones as well. So the medically important fungi really in general are not very contagious, and they're also not very pathogenic, and most importantly, fortunately, they're not very deadly either, but in certain conditions they can be. So some examples just that we all know about, of course, are diseases like athlete's foot, right? The dermatophytosis type of disease where we have dermatophytes that reside between our toes and underneath our nails. But another disease many of you may be familiar with is Pneumocystis, which is a type of fungal disease that is much more likely to occur among individuals who have HIV or AIDS. Now, Candida albicans, which many of you I'm sure are familiar with, is also an organism that probably is living on most of you. Generally it's benign, lives on the skin or the mucous surfaces, and is basically commensal. But we'll see in some cases, some situations, those Candida albicans organisms can certainly overgrow the tissue. So what are some of these fungal diseases? Well, any fungal disease that infects the human host is called a mycosis. So fungal mycosis are generally diseases that, again, are chronic and long-term. These mycoses can be classified according to where they infect the human host and the tissues that are involved. Now, many other criteria exist for classifying fungi, but many of these criteria pertain to fungi that are not relevant in terms of human health. So these criteria are generally the ones that most scientists use to classify these fungal infections. So these infections can be superficial, they can be cutaneous, they can be subcutaneous, opportunistic, or systemic. So in terms of going deeper into the human body, we'll start off with superficial and then we'll progress further. So superficial fungal diseases, we're not really going to present an example of these because they're really, really uncommon. They are fungi that are localized on the very top of the skin, the very outer layers of the epidermis, and they're also in hair shafts. Now, these infections are more prevalent in tropical climates, but they tend to be benign. They're rare in terms of causing any kind of health consequence. So you can see here we have both a micrograph, a tissue histograph of both the epidermis and the dermis. And then we also have a figure in relationship to the normal skin. So you can see, so these layers are also going to tell us about these different types of infection. So the cutaneous fungal diseases are the fungi that infect the epidermis, and that includes the hair, the skin, and the nails, but also certainly the mucous membranes. And these cutaneous fungal diseases are called dermatomycoses, and they infect, again, cutaneous surfaces, and the actual fungi are called dermatophytes. And you know, many of you may remember that commercial that comes on for a while. It was way too often, and it showed these cartoon characters called dermatophytes that basically took up residence under people's toenails. And then, of course, when that monster medication came along, they were eradicated. So these are the same dermatophytes. And these dermatophytes, the way they get in under our skin is they secrete this enzyme called keratinase. And this keratinase eats away at that wonderful keratin. And this keratin is the protein component of hair and skin. So that's really how they break our skin surface and end up, you know, creating a little place for them to live for often a very, very long time. And so here are two examples of those kind of diseases: ringworm and athlete's foot. Now, subcutaneous fungal diseases are fungal diseases that live under the epidermis. And these are infections that are caused primarily by fungi that live in soil and on vegetation. These infections get, of course, under the skin through a puncture wound, like a splinter or a nail, or a thorn, of course, and the fungi actually gets implanted under the skin. Now, for those of you paying attention, what's the other disease that we concern ourselves about when we get a puncture wound? Well, remember that discussion we had about tetanus, right? That if you get a puncture wound and you're outdoors in the soil, or get bitten by an animal, one of the things that often needs to happen if you haven't had a tetanus vaccine is you need to get yourself to the emergency room and get some gamma globulin. So that's, of course, in the bacterial lectures, we're now talking about fungi, but, you know, as practitioners, which many of you will eventually be, you need to concern yourselves with all of these things. Now, what's the viral disease? Remember, rabies. Rabies is a disease that is a virus, and that one you would also get gamma globulin for, and then also vaccination. So infections, in this particular case, these subcutaneous fungal diseases, tend to occur among farmers that have frequent contact with the soil. Now, in this particular specimen, or this gentleman's hand, you can see that he's injured his middle finger and with a nail or a thorn, and that's how the fungi got in under his skin, and then the actual fungal disease spread through the draining lymphatics. And you can see over here in this side of his wrist that he actually has these nodules where the fungi are now residing. Now, Candidiasis albicans, as we talked about, is a very common yeast infection of the human organism. In fact, probably all of us have Candida albicans somewhere in our body. And for the most part, it's benign, it resides there, it's commensal. But it becomes problematic, really, when that candida becomes overgrown. And we're going to talk about examples where that happens. So, you know, but the interesting thing about candidiasis is that it can occur cutaneously, it can occur subcutaneously, and it can also develop into a systemic infection. So candidiasis is resistance to phagocytosis. Remember, that's a process that the immune cells engage in. and it's not affected by antibacterial drugs. So sometimes, for instance, one might think that you have a bacterial infection when really it's a yeast infection. But what happens when you take bacterial or antibacterial drugs is you actually promote overgrowth of candidiasis. So sometimes that happens, of course, when you take antibiotics, but changes in the pH, for instance, can allow these candidiasis to overgrow in the genital tract, for instance. And immune-compromised individuals are also prone to candida infections of the skin and the mucous membrane. So really, there's a lot of reasons why these candidiasis infections can become problematic. So the other thing about candidiasis is that it's contagious. So they are spread by sexual contact, and certainly you can catch candidiasis from your sexual partner. And again, it's not treated by antibiotics, and sometimes the symptoms of a candidiasis infection, especially in the genital tract, is very much like a bacterial infection. But again, taking antibiotics are really going to make the situation worse. Now, individuals that are immune compromised, like those who have HIV/AIDS, can suffer from much more severe forms of candidiasis. So there's a particular candidiasis infection of the mouth called thrush, and that's quite a prominent type of candida infection that generally is a hallmark sign of actually the individual having HIV and AIDS. But more importantly, candidiasis can become a systemic infection, and in several cases, or in rare cases, it actually can result in death. So candidiasis really is an organism that we certainly need to be concerned with, especially under conditions of immune suppression. Now, opportunistic fungal diseases. Now, candidiasis can also be thought of as an opportunistic infection. So it really crosses over all these different categories. But in general, opportunistic fungal diseases are ones that are harmless in their normal habitat, but can become pathogenic in a host for various reasons. One of those reasons is if the host becomes debilitated or traumatized. Things like severe burns, severe wounding, just weakening, shock, reasons that one damages a large area of tissue. That tissue can become susceptible to an opportunistic fungal infection. Now, also under treatment with broad spectrum antibiotics can lower, right? So what do antibiotics do, right? They eradicate the bacterial infection, but they also cause other things to happen. And one of the things they do, because sometimes what actually keeps these fungi in check in a commensal way are the other commensal bacteria. So when you wipe out those commensal bacteria, all of a sudden these fungi have nobody to compete with, and then they grow in an out of control fashion. The other reason is if one's immune system is suppressed due to medication. So, for instance, cancer patients that are undergoing chemotherapy become susceptible to these fungal infections. And finally, patients who have immune disorders, and those immune disorders again can result from disease like HIV or AIDS, but they can also result from other autoimmune diseases, and they can result from genetic susceptibility, and they can also result from lung disease. So that's quite a few reasons why we need to worry about some of these fungal infections. So an example of a very well-known opportunistic fungal infection is Pneumocystis. Now, Pneumocystis is generally a benign fungi that lives in the lungs of most individuals. And when the AIDS epidemic came into reality, right, in the mid to late 80s, then all of a sudden the incidence of Pneumocystis also rose as the AIDS epidemic started and continued. And I'm going to show some data about that. It's very interesting. And so in general, this pathogen is found living in a commensal way in the lung tissue, but it actually lives at the ends of the alveoli, or at the ends of the bronchial tree. And at those ends, those of you who remember your physiology and anatomy courses, right? We have squamous epithelium, the very thin layer of squamous epithelium. And these fungi live in the protective layer, right, around, or in the lining, excuse me, of these lung alveoli. So if you can imagine, the lung alveoli are like little balloons, right, at the end of the bronchial tree. And these balloons catch the air, right, and that's where we have gassy exchange with the capillaries, where we take in oxygen and we release carbon dioxide. Now, in this wonderful aerated balloon is where these Pneumocystis fungi live. Now, obviously, there are not very many of them, but certainly they live in probably most, if not all of us. However, when the individual is suffering from immune deficiency, then the susceptibility, of course, greatly increases. And here you can see the cysts of Pneumocystis actually living in the lungs of patients with AIDS. And Pneumocystis is another indicator disease that can point to somebody potentially having HIV and AIDS, even and sometimes actually in the early stages of the AIDS epidemic, before we were able to test for AIDS antibodies, these were some of the marker diseases that indicated that indeed the individual had HIV and AIDS. So here is a life cycle of a Pneumocystis, and you can see that this cyst form, right, actually lives in those lung alveoli. And if the fungi is replicating, right, it's expanding, it's colonization, then it ruptures. So the cyst, when it matures, it ruptures and it releases all of these trophozoites. And then these trophozoites grow up, right, and then they replicate and they eventually become cysts that can then release more trophozoites. So I guess you can imagine how quickly a Pneumocystis infection can really occur. Now, obviously, having all these cysts in the lung creates a huge immune reaction, creates a lot of fever, flu-like symptoms, and certainly individuals can die from Pneumocystis. And with HIV and AIDS, a lot of times it's not HIV or AIDS that kills the individual, it's these opportunistic infections. So here is early incidence of Pneumocystis pneumonia. And you can see really the incidence starting to increase around the time that the HIV/AIDS epidemic began. And so even in light of prophylactics, which are medications that were given to patients with PCP, which is what it was caused, even in that case, they were able to certainly slow down, right? So they were able to slow down the rate of increase of the epidemic, but it wasn't able to eliminate the epidemic by any means. But interestingly, as patients started using these antiretroviral therapies, you can see that the incidence of PCP actually started going down. So you might say, well, what do you think caused PCP incidence to go down? Well, one of the things that these antiretroviral drugs do is they actually increase the immune response. Excuse me. So they actually cause an increased recognition, excuse me, an increased recognition of these organisms. So then all of a sudden the human host is better able to manage the infection and even eliminate the organism, or at least bring it back down to a place where it becomes commensal again. So you can see here the episodes of these pulmonary symptoms. Most reasons in the beginning why individuals were tested for PCP is because they had HIV/AIDS, but now, because the incidence went down along with the AIDS epidemic, you can see now in more recent times, although this is still a rather old article, you can see that in more recent times the incidence is very low, and individuals now aren't necessarily tested if they have HIV or AIDS, but rather if they have the symptoms. Excuse me. So the systemic fungal diseases are mycoses that actually are fungal infections that occur deep within the body, and they're not restricted to any region. They don't necessarily need to occur in the lungs. They can infect other tissues and organs, and they're usually caused by fungi that live in the soil. So the first fungal lecture, or fungi lecture, we talked about histoplasmosis. And the disease we're going to talk about in this lecture is Coccidiomycosis. And they both are somewhat similar, but they certainly have differences. And one of the biggest differences is actually where they're endemic. So in both diseases, the infections begin in the lungs, and then they can spread to other tissues. So here is a better description about Coccidiomycosis, and the other name for that disease is called valley fever, and it's caused by a fungus that lives in the soil. And it's similar again, and the life cycles are similar to histoplasmosis, and it's a disease that's found, the spores are found in the dry soil of the American Southwest. In the tissue, the organism forms a thick-walled body that is filled with endospores. So in a way, it's somewhat like what we saw before, right, with Pneumocystis, right? This one has spores too, and it forms itself in a cyst-like structure. Okay, so here's the life cycle, okay, and you can see that there are two stages. It's dimorphic. So in the human stage, it's like a yeast, right? And in the soil stage, it's like a fungus. So here you can see, and this critical place right here is where the individual inhales one of those spores of this fungi form, and then that spore becomes a spheruole, and then we get development of these endospores, right? Then the cycle really just stays after that point within the human host, and those spherules can spread to the lymphatics and then potentially throughout the body. So in that sense, it's considered to be a systemic infection. So here are the number of Coccidiomycosis cases, right? And you can see, interestingly, there is an increase of cases in general from 2009 to 2012, at least with this data. And a lot of that is occurring in Arizona. So then you might say, well, what might cause the increased incidence of Coccidiomycosis? Well, as we know, right, the spores live in the soil. So what has been going on in the American Southwest the last several years? the American Southwest has been experiencing a very severe drought, number one. Number two, there's been a lot of fires out there. And whenever you have this increase in dried soil or movement of soil of any kind, then you have a greater potential for these spores to become airborne, and then of course for humans to inhale them. Now, the other interesting thing, many of you may live in Southern California. There was a very large earthquake that happened in 1994, and in the San Fernando Valley, after the earthquake, there was a pretty dramatic increase of valley fever in, of course, San Fernando Valley. But interestingly, it was because due to that earthquake, which is a pretty strong earthquake, the soil particles got airborne or made airborne by the earthquake. And then a number of individuals came down with the disease. And normally the number of cases is very, very small. But in this situation, it was a dramatic increase. So here we see the distribution of Coccidiomycosis cases in the American Southwest. And the name actually originated from the San Joaquin Valley, which is a valley where quite a lot of farming occurs in California. And those certain cases of valley fever are found much more often there than other parts of the United States. But also in general, the whole Southwest has a real endemic level of these cases. And there was an outbreak in 2001 in this, I guess, northeastern corner of Utah, and that was the location of, I guess, archaeologists who were excavating these Indian ruins, and then of course many of them came down with valley fever. So, you know, sometimes when these events occur, of course, then you can see an increased incidence, but in general it is still a relatively rare infection. So let's now ask some questions about the material. So the first question we have is, and these are questions that probably your professor or your teacher would ask. These are the harder questions. These are not the easy pattern, I call them pattern recognition questions. These are not pattern recognition questions. These are the real thinking questions. So this question is, what are the differences between opportunistic and systemic infection? Well, as we saw in our examples, they can be very similar, right? But the reasons for the onset of an opportunistic infection is different than the reasons for systemic infections. And so that's really the key. So the real key here is reason, okay, for infection. Okay, so what does that mean, right? Well, remember, the systemic infections occur just naturally in an immune competent individual, right? So developing or coming down with valley fever, right, that's a systemic infection, and that occurs not just among individuals who are immune suppressed, but really among healthy individuals. But opportunistic infections are really infections by benign organisms I sometimes misspell on these boards. You have to excuse me there. But on these opportunistic infections, these are infections by generally benign organisms, right? And these benign organisms generally don't cause infection unless, big reason, the individual is immune compromised. Okay, so certainly this immune compromised individual can get a systemic infection, right? And then perhaps they could even have a worse form of a systemic infection. And often these opportunistic infections infect the entire body. But really this definition of what an opportunistic infection is critical, and it's not just limited to fungi. It's also a concept that certainly relates to bacteria as well. So the second question is, why do you think we don't have vaccines for fungal infections? So that's a challenging question, isn't it? So let's think about what fungal infections are all about. Okay, so let me ask the audience the question, do fungal infections cause a lot of deaths? The answer is no, right? They tend to be benign. Now, they do cause death among immune-compromised individuals, right? Okay, I'm just going to make that arrow to show that this that means immune-compromised individuals. And what do we know about immune-compromised individuals? We talked a little bit about this in the immunology lectures. Immune-compromised individuals, by definition, don't have immune reactions to antigens. So we could develop all the vaccines in the world, and this immune-compromised individual will not develop immunity to this antigen introduced by the vaccine because the immune system is so suppressed, right, it doesn't recognize the antigen. So those are really the $2 million reasons why you would actually get this question correct. So that concludes our lecture on fungal diseases part 2. Thank you so much for visiting educator.com.